Here's a question that should bother you more than it probably does. The single most influential military mind in human history might never have existed. His name sits on the desks of CEOs and four-star generals, gets quoted in boardrooms and barracks and self-help podcasts, and yet there's a very real possibility that Sun Tzu was nobody. Not a man or a general, instead just a title, slapped onto a collection of ideas assembled by committee over the course of a century or more. The Art of War is arguably the most widely read strategic text ever written, and the identity of its author remains one of the oldest unsolved mysteries in intellectual history. Sun Tzu isn't a personal name. It's an honorific, roughly translated as Master Sun. His supposed given name was Sun Wu, and traditional accounts place his birth around 544 BC in the state of Qi, during what historians call the Spring and Autumn period. This was a time of extraordinary political fragmentation when the old Zhou dynasty was collapsing and over 100 rival states were fighting for dominance. It was also a golden age of philosophy, and Confucius was developing his ethical framework while Lao Tzu was laying the foundations of Taoism. Sun Tzu, according to tradition, emerged from this era as a thinker who turned his mind not toward morality or metaphysics, but toward the ruthless calculus of war. The earliest biographical account comes from the records of the Grand Historian, composed around 94 BC by the Han Dynasty historian Sima Qian. According to this account, Sun Wu, who had already written extensively, traveled to the state of Wu, where he was introduced to King He Lu. What follows is one of the most famous anecdotes in Chinese historical writing. He Lu, intrigued by Sun Wu's treatise, challenged him to demonstrate his principles by training 180 palace concubines into soldiers. Sun Wu divided them into two groups, appointed the king's two favorites as commanders, and issued orders. When the women laughed and ignored him, he had the two favorites executed over the king's protests, and the remaining women obeyed without hesitation. He Lu, shaken but impressed, appointed Sun Wu as a general in his army, and as they say, the rest is history. According to this traditional account, this grand general would then go on to lead his troops to major victories in well-known and documented historical battles. It's a compelling story, and it's also, almost certainly, more parable than history. Skepticism about Sun Tzu's existence didn't begin with modern Western scholars. It started in China itself during the Song dynasty. In the 12th century, the scholar Ye Shi noticed something troubling for such a great figure. The most detailed contemporary chronicle of the Spring and Autumn period never mentions Sun Tzu at all. To make matters worse, this text covers the Battle of Boju in 506 BC, the very battle Sima Qian credits Sun Tzu with winning. But this isn't just a brief mention. The battle is covered in considerable detail, yet the supposed mastermind behind the victory doesn't appear anywhere in its pages. For a military genius who allegedly transformed the state of Wu into a major regional power, this silence is deafening. The problems don't end there. The name Sun Wu doesn't appear in any surviving text written before Sima Qian's records. Some scholars have suggested the name itself might be a literary invention, a descriptive label rather than an actual identity. According to Chinese scholars, the surname Sun can be read as a cognate of a word meaning fugitive, while Wu carries the meaning of valiant or warrior. Put together, the name reads less like a birth certificate and more like a character description, the valiant fugitive warrior. Given his martial prowess and the fact that he left his homeland to serve another king, seems to suggest that Sun Wu, presented as his actual name, may have been a later invention. However, this presents another problem, since someone of a different name and of equal strategic prowess should likely be mentioned in the historical accounts of the Battle of Boju. Then there's the text itself. the art of war contains anachronisms that don't fit a 6th century BC origin. It references crossbow technology that wasn't widely available until the Warring States period, roughly a century later. It also describes large-scale conscript armies and professional generalship, features of warfare that didn't exist during the spring and autumn period. During this period, battles were smaller affairs, dominated by hereditary aristocratic commanders, who commanded regardless of merit. The philosophical vocabulary also aligns more closely with Warring States era thought. The text suggests the author was familiar with major schools of philosophy that were in a nascent form at the time the art of war was traditionally believed to be authored. Yet despite this, the author shows a great degree of familiarity with these concepts, which is highly improbable or perhaps impossible based on competing timelines. Taken together, these inconsistencies have led a significant number of historians to conclude that the art of war wasn't written in the late 6th century BC. This has given rise to what scholars call the accretionist theory, the idea that the art of war wasn't the work of one author, but rather a body of strategic thought that accumulated over time. Under this model, a kernel of military wisdom may have originated with a real figure associated with the state of Wu. However, the text was expanded, revised, and refined by generations of strategists across the Warring States period. By the time it reached its final form, it represented the collected thinking of an entire tradition rather than the insights of a single mind. Some proponents suggest the text was eventually attributed to a legendary master Sun, in accordance with the Chinese convention of crediting a school of thought to a founding sage. This isn't as unusual as it might sound. The same authorship questions surround other towering figures of ancient Chinese philosophy. Lao Tzu, the supposed founder of Taoism, may not have been a historical individual either. Confucius himself, though likely more firmly historical, also didn't write directly, and his Analects are a collection of his sayings and anecdotes, which were recorded by his students. Some of this unwritten Confucian wisdom may have been expanded upon and then attributed to Confucius by these disciples. And in the Western tradition, we've been arguing about Homer since the Golden Age of Athens. The ancient world's relationship with authorship was fundamentally different from our own. The debate took a dramatic turn in April 1972 when construction workers in Shandong province accidentally unearthed a pair of Han Dynasty tombs at the Silver Sparrow Mountain. Inside tomb number 1, archaeologists discovered 5,000 bamboo strips covered in densely written characters. The strips had been preserved for over 2,000 years by groundwater saturation and airtight conditions. Among the texts recovered were 13 fragmentary chapters of Sun Tzu's Art of War, but there was also something else. There were 16 chapters of an entirely separate text known as the Art of War by Sun Bin. This was a revelation. Sun Bin was a figure who had long been conflated with Sun Tzu in Chinese historical writing. Classical texts referred to both men simply as Master Sun, and because Sun Bin's treatise had been lost in antiquity, significant confusion arose among scholars. Most historians had come to believe that Sun Tzu and Sun Bin were the same person. The discovery proved they weren't, and Sun Bin, who lived in the 4th century, had produced a completely distinct work, though one with some notable overlaps with the earlier text. The find demonstrated that by the 2nd century BC at the latest, the Chinese literary tradition recognized 2 separate master-son figures with 2 separate military treatises. Ultimately, modern scholarship recognizes 3 viable possibilities about the historicity of one of the greatest thinkers in military history. The first is the traditional view. Sun Tzu existed as a historical figure in the late 6th century BC, served the king of Wu, and authored the core of the art of war. The second is a modified historicist position. A real military figure existed, but later in time than tradition suggests, and his original work was substantially expanded by later hands. The third is the full skeptic's position. Sun Tzu never existed as a discrete individual, and the art of war is the accumulated product of an entire military intellectual tradition. Under this view, it was assembled either by committee or over time and attributed after the fact to a legendary figure. But the honest answer is that we simply don't know, and we may never know, because something happened that may make this answer unknowable. The destruction of texts ordered by the Qin Emperor in 213 BC obliterated vast quantities of pre-imperial Chinese writing. To create a new imperial state, he wanted to eliminate many remnants of the past which were incongruent with his idea of what the Chinese Empire would be. And yet, here's the thing that makes this question fascinating rather than merely academic. It doesn't diminish the text one bit. Whether the art of war was the product of a single brilliant strategist or the distilled wisdom of generations, its influence is beyond dispute. It shaped celebrated campaigns during the Three Kingdoms period in the 3rd century, informed Napoleon's approach to maneuver warfare, and was required reading for officers in Imperial Japan. Figures as varied as Chairman Mao, Douglas MacArthur, and Ho Chi Minh all sought inspiration from the text. Today, it's assigned in business schools and quoted in political strategy, and the ideas endure because they work, regardless of who first articulated them. Sun Tzu, whoever or whatever he was, understood something most people still struggle to grasp. The best victories are the ones achieved before the fighting starts. That insight didn't require a single author, nor did it require a real name. It just required someone, at some point in the violent churn of ancient China, to write it down on a strip of bamboo and trust that it would survive, and against all odds, it did. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a reminder to hit the share button and send this video to your friends and family who enjoy historical content. Also, don't forget, you can also find more of my historical content on my Spotify video podcast as well, at Lazy Chill History. In the summer of 323 BC, Alexander the Great lay dying in Babylon. He was 32 years old and had conquered more of the known world than any single individual before him. His empire stretched from Greece to the borders of India, encompassing Egypt, Persia, and vast stretches of Central Asia. But there's an ancient history mystery that's fascinated scholars since antiquity, one that sits at the intersection of what Alexander knew and what he didn't. As he gazed westward from his deathbed, did he have any meaningful awareness of the small but growing Roman Republic on the Italian peninsula? While the short answer is almost certainly yes, there's more to the story than that. The longer and far more interesting answer involves trade networks, diplomatic envoys, Greek colonies, and the ambitions of a man who reportedly wept because he had no conquests left. It's tempting to imagine the ancient world as a patchwork of isolated civilizations, each ignorant of the other, but that picture is simply wrong. By the 4th century BC, the Mediterranean was a deeply interconnected body of water. Greek colonies dotted the coastlines of southern Italy and Sicily, a region the Greeks themselves called Magna Graecia, or Greater Greece. Cities like Syracuse, Tarentum, and Neapolis weren't backwaters, but rather thriving centers of Greek cultural life. Syracuse alone rivaled Athens in wealth and prestige during certain periods of the classical era. These Greek colonies had been in direct and sustained contact with the Italian peoples, including the Romans, for generations. Trade goods, mercenaries, political refugees, and intelligence flowed freely between the eastern and western Mediterranean. Greek potters sold their wares in Roman markets, and Roman elites were already beginning to absorb elements of Greek culture. The idea that Alexander, who was educated by Aristotle and maintained a sophisticated network of correspondence across the known world, would have been ignorant of Rome doesn't add up. The Greeks of Magna Graecia would have known about Rome, and what the Greeks of the West knew, the Greeks of the East could easily learn. Several ancient writers explicitly claim that Alexander had contact with Rome, though these accounts need to be handled carefully. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder recorded that a Roman embassy was sent to Alexander, though the details are sparse. Many scholars question whether this event actually occurred or was a later Roman invention designed to elevate their city's importance in retrospect. After all, the lack of direct attention paid to Rome by Alexander was, paradoxically, something of a sore spot for the Romans. Another writer, writing in the 2nd century AD, but drawing on much earlier sources, mentioned that various embassies from Italy came to Alexander in Babylon. Some versions of this account include the Romans among those delegations, though again this has to be handled with caution. The Greek historian Strabo noted the broader awareness Greeks had of Italy and its peoples. Cleitarchus, one of the earliest historians of Alexander's campaigns, apparently referenced Western peoples seeking audiences with the conqueror. Unfortunately, though, his original work survives only in fragments cited by later authors, so it remains unclear who these people were. While some have speculated these could have included Romans, others believe that this could be a reference to the Carthaginians or other Western Mediterranean groups. The Roman historian Livy, writing during the reign of Augustus, famously digressed into an alternative history scenario. And I need to take a moment here to shout out one of the first known instances of written alternative history in human history. In Book 9 of Ab Urbe Condita, he posed a striking question. What if Alexander the Great hadn't died young and had instead marched his armies west into Italy? If you're familiar with Livy and his relationship with Augustus, and his promotion of the power of traditional Roman virtues versus Greek ideas, you'll be able to guess what comes next. Livy treats the scenario seriously, weighing Alexander's reputation as one of history's greatest commanders against the rising power of Rome. He acknowledges Alexander's tactical brilliance and the fear his name inspired across the known world, but ultimately argues that Rome would have prevailed. In Livy's view, Rome's strength did not rest on a single man, but on its institutions, its deep reserves of manpower, and its network of loyal allies. Even a conqueror like Alexander, he suggests, would have struggled against a system designed to endure setbacks and recover. Of course, knowing that Alexander was a man who maintained an undefeated record taking on the massive Persian Empire, this strains credulity in the extreme. However, his point was to prove that with traditional Roman know-how and a good deal of traditional Roman gumption, the Romans could have somehow managed a hard-fought victory. I question whether Livy himself even believed that this was the case, but of course, as I mentioned, the man had an agenda, and facts weren't going to get in the way of his conclusion. Livy's entire digression only makes sense if his audience already accepted the premise that Alexander at least knew Rome existed. But of course, the difficulty is separating genuine 4th century BC intelligence from later literary invention. Roman writers had a strong incentive to connect their city to Alexander, since it made Rome seem important on the world stage from an earlier date. It also flattered Roman vanity by placing their ancestors in the same narrative as the greatest conqueror who ever lived. Livy's conclusion, too, again, serves more as a flattery of Rome rather than an accurate depiction of the relative strengths of the Romans versus Alexander's army. Here's a detail that often gets overlooked. Alexander's maternal uncle, Alexander of Epirus, actually led a military campaign into southern Italy in 334 BC. This was the very same year Alexander the Great crossed into Asia. Alexander of Epirus had been invited by the Greek city of Tarentum to help defend against the Lucanians and Bruttians, Italic peoples who were pressing hard against the Greek colonies. He fought several battles, won some early victories, and was eventually cut down at the Battle of Pandosia around 331 BC. This was a major military expedition by a king who was closely related to Alexander the Great by blood and by marriage. Alexander of Epirus had married Cleopatra of Macedon, Alexander the Great's full sister. The wedding itself was the very occasion at which Philip II of Macedon was assassinated. The idea that Alexander the Great wouldn't have known about his own uncle's military adventures in Italy strains credulity beyond the breaking point. Ancient sources record that Alexander of Epirus made a somewhat bitter comparison, reportedly saying that while his nephew fought effeminate soldiers in Asia, he himself fought men in Italy. Whether or not this quote is genuine, it reflects a tradition that both campaigns were understood as parallel enterprises by contemporaries. And as an aside, the quote was filtered through Roman sources, and the Romans loved to portray themselves as rugged, manly men, so there's reason to believe the exact quote was altered. If Alexander the Great received reports from his uncle's Italian war, and it would be extraordinary if he didn't, then he'd have received intelligence about the political landscape. Alexander would have had to have at least some knowledge of central and southern Italy, including the growing influence of Rome. So if Alexander was aware of Rome, what would he have actually known? In the 330s and 320s BC, Rome wasn't yet the superpower it would become. It hadn't even completed the conquest of the core regions of the Italian peninsula. The Romans were still fighting the Samnite Wars, a grueling series of conflicts against the tough mountain peoples of central Italy that would drag on for decades. Rome was still a generation or more away from dominating all of Italy, let alone projecting power across the wider Mediterranean. Its population was substantial but not enormous, and its navy was essentially non-existent, at least compared to the Greek city-states in Italy, as well as the Carthaginians. To Alexander, Rome would have looked like one of many regional powers in the Western Mediterranean. He may have thought it notable, perhaps, for its military tenacity and its unusual republican form of government, but not yet a rival to the great empires of the East. He would have understood it primarily through the lens of Greek colonial reports. The Greeks of southern Italy would have described Rome as a significant and expanding Latin city-state with a capable army. It was one that was increasingly asserting dominance over its neighbors, but that hadn't yet entered the big leagues of Mediterranean politics. Alexander's court would have also understood Rome's geography quite thoroughly. Greek navigators and traders had mapped the Italian coastline thoroughly, and Greek colonies maintained regular shipping routes to and from the eastern Mediterranean. Aristotle himself, Alexander's former tutor, collected constitutions from across the Greek world and was interested in comparative political systems. It's entirely plausible that Alexander had access to at least a basic understanding of Roman political organization through the intellectual networks his teacher had established. That said, he would have almost certainly known that Rome didn't have a king, and in fact, had a well-known hatred of monarchy. Their republican form of government would have perhaps been the fact that made Rome stand out as interesting to Aristotle, and from there, that would have been transmitted to Alexander. There's another tantalizing thread. Multiple ancient sources claim that Alexander was planning a massive westward campaign at the time of his death. Diodorus Siculus described plans that included the conquest of Carthage, a circumnavigation of either Arabia or Africa, and operations in the western Mediterranean. If these plans were genuine, and historians are split on this, they suggest Alexander viewed the West as a future theater of operations. Alexander likely wouldn't have planned a campaign into the Western Mediterranean without having significant intelligence about who controls what territory there. After all, one of the ways Alexander was able to function as such a brilliant strategic commander, as well as a tactical field commander, was through gathering intelligence. Whether Alexander specifically planned to confront Rome is ultimately unknowable, barring the discovery of new primary sources. That said, it's possible that Rome would have played only a minor role in these plans, since, as I mentioned, there was a much greater power in the region. Carthage, not Rome, would have been the more obvious Western target given its wealth, naval power, and control of key trade routes across the Western Mediterranean. But any serious campaign in the Western Mediterranean would eventually have brought Alexander into contact with Roman territory or Roman interests. The Romans controlled a growing stretch of central Italy by this point, and any force operating in the region would have had to account for them. The question of whether Alexander knew about Rome matters because it speaks to a larger truth about the ancient world. Alexander's empire was built on intelligence as much as brute force, and his court in Babylon attracted embassies and visitors from across the known world. He surrounded himself with men who made it their business to understand the political geography of every region within reach. Alexander the Great almost certainly knew about Rome. He would have known it as a rising but still regional power in central Italy. He couldn't have known, that this same city would eventually eclipse his own empire and come to dominate the entire Mediterranean world. And that's the great irony. The man who conquered what was then the meaningful known world probably gave Rome almost no thought whatsoever, much to the shame of the Romans themselves. Somewhere around 520 BC, a man whose name most people have never heard set out on one of the most extraordinary voyages in the ancient world. His name was Scylax, and he came from a tiny place called Carianda, a small island settlement off the coast of Caria, in what's now southwestern Turkey. He wasn't Greek in the way we'd typically imagine. He was almost certainly an ethnic Carian, a member of an ancient people who spoke a language scholars still haven't fully deciphered. However, he knew Greek well and used it for his writing, as was the style in that place and time. His hometown sat just 10 miles north of Halicarnassus, which would later produce Herodotus, and roughly 20 miles south of Miletus, the intellectual powerhouse of the Ionian world. At the time, Caria was under the control of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. This was the empire of Darius I, one of history's great empire builders, a ruler whose ambitions stretched from the Aegean Sea to Central Asia. Darius wanted to understand his empire, to map it, to plan his next moves, and fully extract all the wealth he could from it, and that's where Scylax entered the picture. He was, by Herodotus's account, a sea captain, a man Darius trusted to tell him the truth about what lay beyond the empire's eastern frontier. The fact that a Carian was trusted with this mission tells us something important about the Achaemenid world. This was a multi-ethnic empire that drew talent from every corner of its vast domain, and Scylax was proof that competence mattered far more than origin. Darius had a specific obsession. He wanted to know where the Indus River emptied into the sea. Herodotus, writing in his histories, tells us that Darius was eager to learn more about this great river, which he noted was one of only 2 rivers in the world known to produce crocodiles. Darius was planning a conquest, and he needed intelligence for this mission. According to Herodotus, the king assembled a group of men he trusted to report accurately, and among them was Scylax of Carianda. Scholars have long recognized that it was, at its core, a reconnaissance mission, a military survey designed to prepare the ground for Persian expansion into the Indus Valley. The party departed from a place Herodotus calls Caspotyrus, in a region he names Pactaica, Neither name has been definitively matched to a known location, which has caused millennia of scholarly debate. The most widely accepted theory holds that Caspotyrus was a garbled version of Pascopyrus, a Greek rendering of the name for what's now Peshawar in modern Pakistan. This would place the starting point somewhere in the valleys of the Kabul River, within the satrapy of Gandhara. Herodotus noted this was one of the least profitable tax districts of the entire Achaemenid Empire, precisely because it was poorly documented and surveyed. It was a remote and rugged frontier zone, and the kind of place where an ambitious king would naturally want better information, both to increase taxes and to launch further conquest. Here's where the story gets complicated. Herodotus says that Scylax and his crew sailed downstream in an easterly direction to the sea. The problem is that the Indus doesn't flow east, but rather southwest. This contradiction has led some commentators over the millennia to question whether the voyage happened at all. But modern scholars have largely put those doubts to rest, with the most compelling explanation being that Scylax didn't start on the Indus itself. He likely began on the Kabul River, which does flow in a generally easterly direction, and followed it for roughly 200 miles before merging with the Indus. This isn't just an educated guess trying to make the known geographic facts fit the ancient evidence. A fragment preserved by the writer Athenaeus describes Scylax writing about the Indus passing between towering cliffs covered in wild forest and thorny plants before turning. This is a description that fits the Indus River Gorge remarkably well. From that confluence, Scylax would have turned south, following the Indus on its long journey toward the Arabian Sea. The Indus is one of the great rivers of the world, stretching roughly 2,000 miles, and in the 6th century, the lands along it were largely unknown to the Persian and Greek worlds. When Scylax finally reached the delta of the Indus, he found that only one of its several mouths was actually navigable, with the others being too shallow and marshy to allow passage. This kind of practical detail is exactly what Darius would have needed for any form of planned invasion. The river journey was only the beginning. Once Scylax reached the open sea, he turned westward and began one of the most ambitious coastal voyages of the ancient world. His route took him along the shores of the Indian Ocean, hugging the coastline of what's now Pakistan and Iran. The conditions along this stretch, known in antiquity as Gadrosia, were brutal. We know this not from Scylax's own account, which has been lost, but from a later parallel voyage. Nearly 2 centuries afterward, Alexander the Great's admiral Nearchus sailed the same route and left a detailed account which was preserved through a Roman historian. He described ferocious tides, enormous whales, and harsh conditions along the Gadrosian shore, and it's fairly safe to assume that Scylax encountered similar challenges. Scylax likely made a significant stop at Harmozaya, modern Manab in Iran, one of the largest ports in the Persian Gulf region. Here, he may have repaired his ships and resupplied before pressing on. From Harmozaya, the route took him past Makkah, corresponding to modern Oman, and then around the entire Arabian Peninsula. The Arabian coast was dotted with small settlements and trading ports, and Scylax would have passed through waters controlled by communities who managed the coastal trade in incense. The southwestern tip of the peninsula, in what's now Yemen, was home to a port the Greeks later called Eudaimon, meaning prosperous, corresponding to modern Aden. From there, Scylax sailed north through the Red Sea until he reached the area around Suez. Notably, this is the same point from which an earlier Egyptian pharaoh had once dispatched Phoenician sailors to circumnavigate Africa. The entire voyage lasted 30 months, covering roughly 3,200 miles from the Indus Delta to the northern Red Sea alone. Scylax's mission delivered exactly what Darius wanted. Herodotus is quite clear about the sequence of events. Once the voyage was completed, Darius conquered the Indians and made use of the sea in those parts. Around 516 BC, the Indus Valley was incorporated into the Achaemenid Empire as a new province called Hindush. It became one of the wealthiest satrapies in the empire, a testament to the strategic value of the intelligence Scylax had gathered. Herodotus describes Hindush as lying to the west of the Thar Desert, which means the province essentially covered what we'd now call Sindh, the middle and lower Indus basin. The conquest opened up oceanic trade routes between India, Persia, and Egypt, formalizing and controlling the commercial geography of the ancient world. Darius also commissioned a canal connecting the Nile to the Red Sea, commemorating it with inscriptions boasting that ships could now travel from Egypt to Persia by sea. It's impossible to separate this project from the knowledge Scylax brought back given the timelines. The explorer had demonstrated that a continuous sea route existed from the Indus to the Red Sea, and Darius was determined to exploit it fully. After completing his voyage, Scylax appears to have devoted himself to writing, and he produced a work traditionally called the Periplus, which he apparently dedicated to Darius. The book has been entirely lost, surviving only in a handful of quotations scattered across later authors. But those fragments tell us a great deal. The Periplus wasn't just a ship's logbook or a list of distances between ports, and it contained accounts of people, landscapes, natural conditions, and possibly political affairs. Scylax's influence on later writers is real, though often indirect and difficult to trace. Herodotus clearly knew of his voyage as he wrote of his journey. Aristotle also refers to him, and later geographers like Strabo preserve fragments of traditions associated with his work. Even as late as the Roman period, authors like Avienus were still drawing on geographic material that may ultimately go back to early explorers like Scylax. That said, the extent of his direct influence is uncertain. We don't have his original writings, and there's no clear evidence that even figures like Herodotus had access to a formal text written by him. And of course, if you know Herodotus, writing about Scylax's journey with extreme detail and total authority, while having never read the text, would be very on brand. Scylax seems to belong to a broader stream of early geographic knowledge circulating in the Greek world. Perhaps one of the most intriguing legacies of Scylax lies in language, and bear with me here for a moment. The Achaemenid Persians referred to the Indus region as Hindush. In Greek, this became Indos, reflecting the tendency of the Ionic dialect to drop initial aspirated sounds, and from there the Latin word India emerges. While it's impossible to tie this transformation to any single individual, the name India was ultimately likely filtered through this little-known ancient mariner. Interestingly, a later geographical work, now known as the Periplus of Pseudo-Scylax, was long attributed to him, and this attribution, though false, is very important. Written in the 4th century BC, it surveys the Mediterranean and surrounding coasts, but modern scholarship has shown it belongs to a much later intellectual context. This does speak to the influence Scylax had during the period, even though he's virtually unknown today. Someone wrote a work that was perceived to be of such quality that it must have come from Scylax, at least according to ancient people. The real Scylax, meanwhile, remains just out of reach, known only through fragments, references, and the enduring shadow of a journey that reshaped how the Greek world understood the East. What happened to Scylax after his voyage and his writing? The honest answer is that nobody knows. Some scholars have speculated that after reaching the Red Sea, he may have traveled overland to a Persian administrative center like Memphis to report his findings. That said, there's no direct evidence for this in any ancient sources, and it remains an educated guess. His writings are lost, but echoes of them survive in later authors, shaping early Greek ideas about lands to the east. Even the name India, derived from the Persian Hindush and the Greek Indos, reflects the kind of cultural exchange that journeys like his helped make possible. And yet, despite all of that, despite all he accomplished, despite his fame in the ancient world, today almost no one remembers him. Scylax of Carianda remains a man whose traces are everywhere, but whose story survives only in brief fragments filtered through great ancient scholars.